All right, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for a very special International Energy and Climate webinar, title of which is What Happened at COP26 and Why It Matters. We're glad all of you can join us from around the world today and join us for a special discussion with some very distinguished presenters, with the focus being the recent United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Scotland, and what that means for future climate action. My name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I also serve as Academic Coordinator for the Energy Analysis and Policy Program here at Wisconsin, which is one of the co-hosts of this webinar, along with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, or IIASA. Since we do have people tuning in from around the world, I wanted to first provide a little bit more background on the hosting organizations before we introduce our speakers. So Energy Analysis and Policy is a graduate certificate and doctoral minor program here at Wisconsin. The main thrust of it is applying an interdisciplinary approach to energy systems and the policies that shape them. So our interdisciplinary curriculum gives students the knowledge and skills needed to become leaders in industry, government, consulting, nonprofits, and other roles in the energy field. And we have a vibrant community of students, faculty, alumni, and friends and other professionals that work together to advance the world's transition to a sustainable energy future. Our partners for this webinar, IIASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, is an independent international research institute based in Austria that conducts multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research to help policymakers find long-term solutions to global and universal challenges facing those countries. They have national member organizations in Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Europe. And this institute has nearly 50 years of experience conducting policy-oriented research into issues that are too large or complex to be solved by any single country or academic discipline. This includes pressing concerns that affect the future of all humanity, such as climate change, energy security, population, aging, and sustainable development. And the results of IIASA research and the expertise of its researchers are made available to policymakers around the world. This year, these two hosting organizations formed a new collaborative program called the IIASA UW-Madison Partnership. And this program establishes a long-term relationship between these two research institutions in the areas of energy, climate, and the environment, with the goal to enhance education, research, and the role of science in diplomacy and international understanding. And so in the spirit of that collaboration, we're excited to offer this webinar today featuring presenters representing both UW-Madison and IIASA. A few logistical items before we turn it over to our presenters. This webinar is being recorded. It is available on demand for those who registered through Zoom, and it'll also be posted to the EAP program's YouTube channel in the next few days. Live captioning is available. You can toggle that feature using the live transcript button in Zoom. Like I said before, you're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat where you're from. If you do have any specific questions for any of our presenters, we ask that you type that into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to direct that question to the appropriate speaker. So the format that we're going to go with, our first two speakers will each provide some introductory remarks, followed by kind of a short Q&A for any quick or clarifying questions. We'll then have some reaction from our next two speakers, followed by a Q&A for the whole panel. So that being said, first I will introduce Nova Tebi. Nova is a graduate student at UW-Madison. She's in the Energy Analysis and Policy program and also earning a dual degree in Master of Public Affairs and Master of Public Health. She works with Professor Jonathan Patz, who's the director of the Global Health Institute at UW-Madison, to inform climate policy in Wisconsin, the United States, and other countries, and provide perspectives on the health and equity impacts of those policies. Noah recently attended COP26 and will share some of her experiences and insights for climate action. So welcome, Nova.
Thank you so much. Hi, yes, my name is Nova Tebi. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a graduate student here at UW-Madison looking at climate change policies that are rooted in health and equity. And I first just want to acknowledge that I am a white cis woman who had the privilege and financial resources to attend COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. And while I was able to be there and talk with delegates and organizations, there were many, many missing voices and voices left out of key negotiations that deserve to be heard and uplifted. With my limited time, I'll try to summarize my perspective on what COP26 accomplished and what I see going forward. So I came into COP26 being fairly pessimistic, not sure what exactly would be accomplished in terms of preventing the globe from warming 1.5 degrees Celsius and preventing catastrophic impacts to humans, non-humans, and ecosystems. And honestly, after the end of the second week of COP26, I was unsurprised by the watered down language of the draft text within 3 days, the minuscule mention of human rights, indigenous rights, and the right to health, and the constant touting of false solutions such as net zero and offsetting, which burden the global south the most. It's sad to see negotiators be happy and clap in the negotiation room when the agreement is nowhere near the goals of 1.5. And until we think about the climate crisis as a last chance of survival, instead of political feasibility, negotiations will not get much better. COP26 brought clarity to me in that there is still the consistent protection of the status quo of current power systems where the rich keep on getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and those in power do everything they can to keep that power. And even though the US claimed to be for climate action and put on a performance of being ambitious, in reality, they have no real incentive to make real action on climate. The US has a vast amount of resources and can afford to wait to act on climate, at least in the affluent areas of the country. And we can no longer support these power structures that incentivize an extractive economy of constant drilling, welling, and complete disregard for human rights. We must move toward one that is regenerative and allows equitable participation, ownership, and sustainability. However, this was not the case at COP26, at least in the negotiation rooms. Most of civil society was not allowed into the negotiation rooms and were only allowed to give a 2-minute statement. And this is part of the missing voices I mentioned earlier, not to mention the other voices who couldn't attend because of vaccine apartheid and financial restraints. What I did see at COP26 that gave me energy and optimism is the amount of pressure civil society puts on these negotiations. Constituencies such as women and gender, trade unions, indigenous peoples, young people, and others have all been fighting for climate justice and equity since the first COP, and they have not let up and continue to push delegates and countries towards climate action. Seeing this energy, this passion, drive, made me rethink what will actually help to prevent climate catastrophe. It is the local organizations, it is the communities who face the worst impacts of the climate crisis. It's the people who see the effects firsthand. Those are the people that will push the world to act. And even though the current power structure is against them, it is these actions and pressure that will help us all. And I remember a very stark quote from one of the panels I attended while I was at COP. And it was a quote from Jenny Stevens from Northeastern University. And she said, "We need social innovations, not technological ones." And I think, that is something to look into further. To dismantle systems, to ensure that everyone has equitable participation and ownership in climate action, we need to think outside the box and outside the system. And while these COPs may not help with climate action in terms of what political leaders do, it does help to bring together civil society from across the world to put real and powerful pressure for equitable climate action. And so I will only focus on these political leaders in terms of how they treat each other and how they treat civil society. But I will not necessarily look towards them for real climate action. The real climate action I have seen is from the local organizations and communities who are starting from the ground up to solve this public health crisis. And now that I'm back here in Wisconsin, I hope to use that energy to bring more conversations, engagement, and action, both here in Madison, in Wisconsin, in the US, and hopefully the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Nova. Are there any quick questions or any clarifying questions for Nova before we turn to our next speaker? So Jacob asks, is there another conference where inclusive community partner participation is the focus?
I'm not sure. I have no idea, but I think especially with COP26, since it's an international conference and it's talking about climate change, that really should be the conference that you have inclusive community participation.
Thanks. If there are no more questions, we'll turn it over to our next speaker. So next speaker is Yuri Rogel, who is Director of Research at the Grantham Institute and a reader in Climate Science and Policy at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London. He's also Senior Research Scholar in Integrated Assessment and Climate Change Research Group for the Energy, Climate, Environment Program at IIASA. Dr. Rogel's interdisciplinary research connects the Earth system sciences to the study of societal change and policy. He is a long-serving lead author on the annual emissions gap reports by the United Nations Environment Program. He has contributed to the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, served as a coordinating lead author on mitigation pathways for the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees of global warming, and as lead author of IPCC's 6th assessment. So as someone who is very much in tune with looking at future climate impacts and understanding what is necessary to reach those targets, Dr. Rogel can really speak to what the countries are promising and where the gap is between where the promises are and what we will need to do in order to achieve those goals. So welcome, Dr. Rogel.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to speak at this webinar. It's really nice that despite the COVID and all the disruption that brought and is still bringing, we also learn that there's technologies that can help better collaboration internationally. So thank you once again. I would like to share my screen, but someone would need to enable me to do that.
Okay,
I see that worked. Perfect. Thank you. And now I hope this works. So by now, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes. Okay,
excellent. So the same title here, what happened at COP26 and why it matters. It's maybe interesting as context. I started my scientific career in climate change actually as part of the COP presidency in 2009 in Copenhagen, which was immediately my first experience with climate change and climate, or with climate policy and climate research. And since then, I've been continuing to follow the international climate negotiations from quite closely. So what I want to do here in the 20 minutes that I have, it's really to look at how climate change mitigation goals have been set and pursued under the UNFCCC. In this presentation, we'll be looking at COP26, and I will be mainly focusing on the mitigation story. There are other important aspects that have been discussed at the COP. I will come back to them shortly, such as mitigation, finance, loss and damage. But the main presentation will cover mitigation. So let's start with what we are actually trying to achieve, or what COP26 actually tries to achieve. And COP26, the Conference of the Parties, is of course a meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the ultimate objective of that convention is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And that is quite vague, and but that was what was decided in or adopted in 1992. Over the years, this has been made slightly more specific. In 2010, at the COP16 in Cancun, this target was made more specific and translated into limiting warming below 2 degrees. But already at that point, there were over 100 countries that found that level of warming to be unacceptably high. And over the 5 following years, there was a process between science and policy that then led to the target, the long-term temperature target that is currently included in the Paris Agreement at COP21. And that is to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit the temperature to 1.5. Also, the last sentence of that target, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impact of climate change, is important. Now, at COP26, this target has, in the view of many analysts and legal scholars, once again been slightly sharpened. COP21 had a focus on well below 2 degrees while pursuing efforts to 1.5. COP26 highlights that it resolves to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And I think this is a really interesting evolution. I think over the past decades and actually leading up to COP21 in Paris, it was the United Nations Framework Convention and the conversations within that forum that really led the world. They were way ahead of where the societal conversation was actually at that stage. Over the past 5 years, we have seen a real turnaround of this conversation. Now, the world, civil society, in some places, even business is leading the COP. So we see a much stronger voice for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, to see 1.5 degrees as the target that should be pursued, even if that is very ambitious. Now, why is COP so important? Well, or COP26, why was that so important? That is because in 2015, at the time of the Paris Agreement basically established what is called the ambition architecture, and which basically consists of 5 yearly cycles where countries submit plans. They are being they are being considered and they are being compared to what would be necessary. And then every 5 years, countries are invited to resubmit updated and strengthened plans. The Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. In 2020 would be the first of those 5 yearly cycles, not yet a full cycle. We can come back to that later. And because of COVID, this was then moved to this year. And that really means that COP26 represented this first time that we would be able to experience whether this architecture of the Paris Agreement and of these ratcheting cycles actually works. So let's have a look at what it delivered. And to look at this, I will be drawing on the work that was done as part of the UN Environmental Programme's emissions gap reports. These reports basically every year, and even here, as you can see here, this report was even published in 2020 while there was no COP. Every year, we look in those reports where emissions are heading based on current policies and current pledges, and where they should be going to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement or of the international climate negotiations. And this then really provides us with a really easy or useful benchmark to know how much progress has been made. So let's start with where we were, and this is pre-COP26. This is the status in at the end of last year. And here you can see a figure with global greenhouse gas emission pathways. At the top, you can see from 2015 to 2030. At the top, you can see where emissions were projected to go if only policies that were in place in 2010 would have continued. Below that, you can see where the current policies that are currently on the books and that are being implemented would lead to by 2030. And then at the bottom, you can see where emission pathways that are consistent with limiting warming to 1.5, 1.8, and then 2 degrees would be leading. Now, to these 4 scenarios, we can then still add where the current pledges would lead to, and there we have 2 scenarios. One where all the pledges that countries would be implementing unconditionally would lead to, that are the unconditional NDCs or national determined contribution, and then the even more optimistic scenario that assumes that all the conditionalities that countries put in their NDCs, in particularly with respect to the provision of finance and support, are also met. And what we can immediately see from this is that we started out with a really important gap between where emissions are heading, either in terms of policies or in terms of pledges, and where they should be going, even just to limit warming to 2 degrees, let alone limiting it to well below 2 degrees or 1.5. So this was at the end of last year. Where are we today? Or what did COP deliver in that sense? By 4 November, and actually this picture, I took it today from the Climate Watch data website. There were around 150 countries covering around 80% of global emissions that had updated new or updated NDCs. Over 60% of those updated NDCs actually lower their emissions. About 13% result still in higher emissions, while for the other NDCs, it is not really possible to compare them to their previous NDCs. Generally, the NDCs are more transparent and include more greenhouse gas targets than prior NDCs. So that is some progress, but let's not declare victory too quickly. Here, this is kind of a waterfall chart which shows how for the G20 countries and then the rest of the world as well, the updated mitigation pledges change emissions compared to the status of their first pledges that were made under the Paris Agreement. And here you can see some really interesting insights, and you can also see that different countries have updated their pledges in very different ways. So for example, when looking at China, China's NDCs is projected to lead to significantly lower emissions because of a strengthening of its previous non-fossil share and carbon intensity targets, while also adding a new renewable energy capacity target. If we go to India, for example, that also made a splash with the new NDCs, we see that there is actually no aggregated impact for that updated NDCs. The reason for that is that previously the NDC was estimated to lead to emissions that are above the current policies of India, and actually the new NDCs put the pledge in line with current policies, but doesn't result in a net reduction in targets. There are a couple of other notable contributors, including the US, of course, where clearly political conditions have changed, and then importantly, the one country where where the NDC or updates to the NDCs have resulted in an increase in emissions is Brazil. So overall, this has led to about a 5 gigaton reduction in emissions projections. And if we compare them to the emissions gap, we can see that there is still an important gap compared to least cost pathways that limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And beside that, there remains an important what we call implementation gap between where current policies are heading and where what countries have pledged or promised. Now, the world doesn't end in 2030. So to understand what temperature implications are of these pathways, we need to extend this into the future. And as you can see that based on just extending the 2030 pledges into the future, we would only avoid around 2.7 degrees of warming with 2 in 3 chance, with a range of plus minus half a degree, depending on how emissions are extended after 2030. However, an important development of COP26 was the submission of, besides NDCs, also of long-term strategies. And these long-term strategies often included net zero targets. These net zero targets, they strongly improve the projections of temperature over the course of the century. For example, if we take the unconditional NDCs with the net zero targets, we come, or our projections suggest that we would avoid around 2.1 degrees or keep warming to 2.1 degrees, where when we start from the conditional pledges, this would be 1.9 degrees, and that's with a 2 out of 3 probability. So this is the first time that these projections come in the neighborhood of 2 degrees, but this is still far from being well below 2 degrees, and let alone limiting warming to 1.5. So the question then, of course, is, has the COP kept 1.5 degrees alive? First of all, I want to highlight that 1.5 degrees within the negotiations is more than just a temperature limit. It is, in a sense, it's almost like a campaign to keep action or keep the highest possible ambition, and to always pursue the highest possible ambition, whether it's 1.5 or as close as possible to it as close to it as possible. But let's see what the current COP delivered. And we can do that here by just looking at how COP26 pledges exhaust the 1.5 degree carbon budget. And here I use the carbon budget from the latest IPCC report that was published in August of this year. So we start with historical emissions, and we can plot the different scenarios on there that I just introduced to you, including the most optimistic COP26 pathway, which includes the conditional NDCs until 2030, and then net zero targets thereafter. And this can then be compared to the carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5. And these are different levels of probability, from 83% probability to 17%. Excuse me. And what you can see here is that in all cases, this budget would be exhausted by 2050. So currently, what is currently on the books is clearly not enough for limiting warming to 1.5. So the next question then becomes, what if we would halve global emissions by 2030? What would that bring? Also here we can then add the carbon budgets. But also here we would see that the carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 with 50% probability would already be exhausted around 2040. So the final case then for comparison is, what would it be if we then further manage to increase our ambition and deliver on the net zero targets? And there you can see that only in that way we can actually keep warming, or keep the budget or the global carbon budget to within the budget for 1.5. I want to highlight here as well that reaching global net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 doesn't mean that every region needs to be net zero at the same time. And in a way, already today, several developed countries, including in Europe, actually have net zero targets that are before net zero CO2 targets that are before 2050, while some developing countries have net zero targets after 2050. An important other aspect, however, is that there is an important credibility gap between near-term pledges and long-term targets or long-term targets announcements. Few G20 members actually put their emissions on a clear path towards achieving their long-term targets, and that is really something that is still key to be achieved here over the next couple of years. So has progress been made? This is a figure from Climate Action Tracker that actually, it's a bit complex, but I think it's really insightful. And it shows over time, this is the year 2009, so the COP15 in Copenhagen, and then it just goes down the years to 2021. And what it shows here on the vertical axis is what in that year was projected to be the temperature outcome of the pledges and the targets in gray, the policies that are in the books in blue. And what you can see is that gradually over time, these projections have been declining as pledges have been increasing. They've also been gone up when here Russia and the US rolled back their pledges. We can also see that policies are gradually improving and declining our projections of global warming. And particularly here in the end, with the additional of net zero announcement, we finally get somewhere below 2 degrees, still not close to 1.5. But this clearly shows that there is progression and that we still fall short. Fortunately, this shortfall was actually explicitly acknowledged in the COP26 outcome, and actually parties decided that they will have a shortened ratcheting cycle, or they actually invite or request countries to revisit their targets by the next COP that will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And then just to spend 1 minute on some of the other aspects that were considered at COP26 and what COP26 delivered. Importantly, first and foremost, the Paris rule book was agreed. That's basically the rules, the nuts and bolts of how the Paris Agreement will be implemented. That's really essential because without those rules, we would be discussing about procedures, but not really getting to action. There were decisions on Article 6 or on carbon markets, which is good that these negotiations have been concluded, but there were also a few disappointments. There is the provisions to increase ambition with carbon markets were severely watered down, and the fact that old emission credits that were generated after 2013 can still be used in the future, at least until 2030, is very disappointing because there is no way that these actually would lead to an increase in ambition. There were further also agreement reached on transparency, which means that we now can track progress on how countries are doing and reducing their emissions or are failing to do so. And also there is an agreement on common timeframes, which basically means that we have now agreed that countries will put forward pledges for the same years, which is really good because that means that there is an opportunity to generate a global momentum towards increasing pledges, whereas otherwise that would be much harder. On adaptation, equally important, but but only limited progress. There is a bit of progress in the adaptation finance that should at least double between 2019 and 2025. And also a share of the proceeds of this carbon market under Article 6 should be going into the adaptation fund. And then finally, one of the biggest disappointments of the COP was that the loss and damage discussion actually didn't go anywhere. And with that, I'm at the end of this presentation. This is once again the conclusion, but I've already over time, so I will stop here and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thanks. We do have a few questions. I might save some of the ones that might generate more discussion toward the end, but I'll address a couple of ones that might have a quick answer. So first one I see is, what level of COVID emissions impacts were included in the 2020 edition of the emission gap assessment of current policies and NDCs?
Yeah, for the COVID was actually included, not so much in the 2020 edition, but much more in the 2021 edition this year, particularly in the projections of current policies. For NDCs, they increasingly have less of an impact. COVID increasingly had less of an impact because many countries now have absolute emissions targets, which of course don't change if the trends change. That target is still there and that is still the pledge. It's only those countries that have energy intensity targets where the pledge assessment would change, or the NDC assessment would change as a result of COVID. But they were taken into account, of course, in a quite rudimentary way, but to our best ability.
And then there's a separate question, maybe following up on that. Going forward, do you anticipate countries changing their projections based on dealing with future pandemics?
Oh, that is, I wouldn't be able to say. I think every country generally won't be planning for a next pandemic, unfortunately. So I don't see kind of a conscious move there. Although many countries will be all countries, I hope, will be taking into account the economic downturn that we have seen, and also the consequences that will still be with us for the years to come.
Okay. Then a couple of questions came in about sort of what incentives are in place to ensure compliance to pledges?
Yeah, so pledges under the Paris Agreement are voluntary. So, and that really means that under the Paris Agreement, there's no real compliance mechanism. Even under the Kyoto Protocol, their pledges or targets were legally binding, but if one didn't meet them, one could just leave the Kyoto Protocol. So that was also not too big of a deal. So what is really important here is that these international pledges, where you can have international diplomatic blaming and shaming going on, but more importantly is that these are translated in national policies, in legal requirements and in strong institutional arrangements in countries so that they actually deliver.
And then one final question, and then we'll save the rest toward the end. So how many of the pledges do you know include carbon capture and sequestration as part of the pledge?
As part of the pledge, I don't really know, because also many of the pledges, particularly the NDCs and even the long-term strategies are not always equally detailed. National plans that are then developed on a national level, for example, in the UK, they include carbon capture and storage or negative emissions in first instance to get to net zero, and that is not necessary to avoid reducing emissions, but it's really to compensate for the last bit of emissions, which until 2050 in many cases we have not yet identified any mitigation options. So I think, but as part of the pledges that are really submitted, I think there are very few that are very explicit about what exactly they entail.
Great, thanks. In the interest of time, we'll move on to reaction from our next two panelists. So first, I'll introduce Dr. Shonali Pachauri. She's research group leader in the Transformative and Institutional and Social Solutions Research Group in the Energy, Climate, and Environment Program at IIASA. Dr. Pachauri's research focuses on the role of technological, institutional, and social innovations for inclusive human development, particularly for those people without access to basic infrastructures and services. She coordinates and leads research on analyzing heterogeneities in energy and infrastructure access and use in the developing world, policy pathways for achieving universal access to modern energy services and technologies, and assessing the wider impacts of this for sustainable development.
Thank you so much, Scott, and hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel and to be able to take part in this event. So we've heard two great talks. Nova got us started, and then Yuri's really rich talk on explaining exactly what's happened at COP and what it means for all of us. And of course, you know, when you hear the two talks, you could say, okay, is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? Quite different perspectives. And I think everyone shares that. And actually, Andy Revkin, who was with New York Times and now at Columbia University, he called it the fact, he said the pact was a triumph of human imperfection. And I really like the way he said that, because I think it's very, very true. So, you know, you read all these competing proclamations of, oh, it was a failure, it was a dangerous compromise, it was a success. And I mean, of course, that's all individual perceptions of what happened there. And I think what we've heard both from Nova and from Yuri has been that, you know, there are some things that give us a bit of optimism. And then there are other things that, of course, don't fill us with a lot of hope. So the ratcheting up of commitments, the new commitments that were made at COP, these are certainly positive outcomes, as Yuri presented and discussed. But of course, given the urgency of the transformation that we require, the ambition level is really incommensurate, especially over the next decade or so. So, I mean, I have basically about 5 minutes here, and I want to leave enough time for Greg's remarks and also for discussion at the end. So I'm going to just say a few things that struck me from what I've learned and what I've read in terms of how you can view the outcomes from an equity lens a little bit. So I think the biggest failure from the equity perspective was that rich countries failed to make good on the 2009 pledge of paying at least 100 billion a year starting in 2020 to poor countries to foster sort of clean energy adoption and build resilience to sea level rise and disrupted weather patterns. So this was, of course, the developed countries not really stepping up to the finance table and delivering on the commitments that they had already made. The other issue was that of loss and damages, which was also kind of skirted, with the focus being more on process and announcing another round of dialogue rather than action on the part of the rich countries to compensate poor and vulnerable nations for the losses and damages that they're already incurring because of the impacts of global warming that they didn't cause, right? And then, as Yuri also mentioned, this Article 6, what the decisions were taken on that, a lot of questionable credits are going through. And this also really hurts the equity agenda because means that the markets will initially be flooded with all these old emission commitments and projects, and less finance will be available through market-based mechanisms. But, you know, at the same time, you know, overall one could conclude that the agreement fails to bridge the long-standing divisions between the industrialized and developing nations, and that this was particularly disappointing for many developing and least developed nations. There was also not much said about the need to alleviate energy poverty, to ensure just and fair energy transitions, particularly for countries in the global south that have contributed little to cumulative emissions and still need to develop. But then there were some signs to be optimistic too. Commitments were revised, and there's also this decision in the text that there will be more focus on adaptive finance for adaptation. This is welcome news. And I think some of the biggest hope really comes from what Nova mentioned at the beginning, the pressure and the engagement of non-state actors, including civil society and youth, that is putting pressure on political leaders for action. And I think that's sort of the biggest hope and one of the big things that we've seen increasingly being spoken about and being heard about as well. So, some of the other things that, again, one could consider sort of partially achievements of what's happened is things like the first direct mention of a commitment to move away from fossil fuels. Now, of course, this could be viewed also negatively because the whole text around this was watered down eventually from phase out to phase down. But in fact, it's the first mention of fossil fuels in any post-1992 agreement. So one could see that as a positive thing. And then, of course, the rule book finalization, that's an important thing. The global methane pledge, which aims for 30% reduction from 2020 levels by 2030, that's also an important outcome. This was signed by about 110 countries. And I believe philanthropies have raised about $325 million to support this, which will be dispersed over the next 3 years. There were some efforts at decarbonizing capital with some financial institutions from about 45 countries committing to aligning their investments to net zero emissions by 2050. So these are, I think, institutions that are part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And then, of course, there were other commitments that either non-state actors made or even national governments made that do provide some hope. But of course, as has also been mentioned in some of the questions that were raised in the Q&A and in the chat, there's a difference between a pledge and then there's, the whole question of what that pledge will actually result in terms of action. And there's really this big need to hold our governments responsible for delivering on those pledges as we go forward. So I'll stop with that and look forward to hearing from Greg and for discussing with all of you after.
Thanks. And last but certainly not least is Professor Greg Nemet, who is professor at the La Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Nemet's research analyzes the process of technological change in energy and its interactions with public policy. And these projects fall in two areas: empirical analysis, identifying the influences on past technological change, as well as modeling the effects of policy instruments on future technological outcomes. He was chair of the Energy Analysis and Policy Program from 2013 to 2018, and he is currently a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report. Welcome.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Scott. And it's great to hear from the panelists and to be part of this seminar. I've learned a lot already, especially Yuri's description of the progression on pledges and progress in both the governance and in the emissions targets. From Nova on the impact of civil society, and then from Shonali, especially on what's been missing in terms of mobilization of climate finance, and especially as means to address the concerns of the most vulnerable. So I think all of those points have been really important. And the three additional points I just say in reflection to those, one is, there are some specific announcements that came out of this that came out not from the overall UNFCCC process, but from this idea that the COP is almost like a festival, and it's a chance for countries, if they're going to do something, to do it in a way that everybody pays attention to. And so an example that Shanali mentioned was the methane pledge of 30% reductions by 2030, a similar type of pledge to stop deforestation by 2030. And one notable one I'd give here, especially considering the two institutions that are on this webinar, is the US-China agreement to cooperate on climate change throughout the 2020s. And this comes at a time when relations between the US and China are very difficult and low and Cold War-like. And it's exactly the forum that IIASA provided in the 1970s and 1980s between East and West, when those societies were similarly poised against each other, but found opportunities to collaborate on science and policy, and in particular on the topic of acid rain. So I take a lot of optimism out of that surprising announcement of US and China cooperating in this important area. Beyond the specific announcements, I think that I would also emphasize is the direction of the climate change regime. And I think Yuri's slides really showed that in a way that I haven't seen done before, in terms of where the targets have come over time, how the government has changed over time. And what's important here is to think about, are we on the right path of a long trajectory of change, or is a new path needed? And coming out of the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009, it was really clear that the existing path had failed and we needed a new path. And the Paris Agreement put us on the new path. And I think we have to say, and it's really backed up by Yuri's slides, is that it does seem we're heading in the right direction. We're the building up of competence and governance, the engagement of lots of different countries, the array of different targets that are included, the system of nationally determined contributions, this ratchet system, the 5-year stocktake, all of this has been in place for 6 years now and has the potential to have this kind of long-term transformation. And so the other thing that does that's really beneficial is to reset expectations so that it becomes a consensus, there's alignment to say, okay, our societies will be net zero around mid-century, and we should be planning for that to happen. And one implication of that is that fossil infrastructure under that type of change in expectation starts to shift from being seen as an asset, incredibly valuable assets. If you look how much oil reserves are valued, or oil infrastructure, or coal production, coal reserves, and gas as well, pipelines, all of that is trillions of dollars of asset. But to see that that could actually change into being a liability, and that financiers and banks and investment banks might start to look, and are starting to already, to look at those assets as problems, as risks that companies that own them have, instead of as valuable assets. That type of change seems to be starting to happen, and this climate change regime has been really helpful in kind of making that happen. And what we need to go to see now is a shift from targets and net zero commitments to plans and policies. And that, that's about becoming much more specific. And a lot of that is domestic. That's not the place of the UN to tell countries what policies they should implement. But that is the next step in terms of making these expectations shift to something that's credible and that will really mobilize change. And then the third reflection I'd just add, it really comes from Nova's remarks, is the role of the youth, of civil society, putting pressure on political institutions domestically and international institutions, such as through the UN, has been just dramatic in the last 3.5 years. It makes a huge difference. It's created real pressure to act. It's giving political cover to delegates at the negotiations that might have a hard time coming back to show their domestic constituents that it was a good idea to agree to this agreement and to give up some national sovereignty because it seemed like a good idea at the time. All this pressure gives them much more cover to be strong on climate. And so that's really important. But just the last thing I would say on that is more of a cautionary or concern about it, is that inevitably we need strong institutions to make this transformation of the global economy to something that's net zero over the next 3 decades. And it's institutions like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which hosted the COP, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, national governments, national environmental ministries, green parties, NGOs, all of those are going to be crucial to making this happen in a way that the commitments are transparent, that people can understand them, that they're implemented well, that the transition happens in a way that works for everybody as an inclusive. Institutions are key to that. And for the youth movement and civil society to put pressure on those institutions to get more ambitious on climate is absolutely critical. The only concern I have on that is that there is some concern that that movement can be attacking those institutions and undermining their credibility. And some of that is starting to happen. And I just don't see how we can get to this transformation to a net zero society in a short amount of time without strong institutions. And so somehow we've got to manage this mobilization of increasingly amounts of concerned citizens and civil societies in a way that spurs action without undermining the institutions that we're going to need to reach these. But yeah, I'll just leave it there so we have time for Q&A. Really great to be part of this, and thanks so much for all the participants for giving their remarks on this.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time to address any more questions, but we'll try our best to address to the panel. One came in that I'm kind of curious. We kind of talked about glass half empty, glass half full. I wonder if any of the panelists would be willing to say sort of what they think the most likely temperature increase the world would hit by 2100. And then I guess there's a second question of that is, how different would be a 1.5 degree increase be versus 3.3 degree increase?
Yuri, I guess you should take that one.
Yeah, I can give it the first try. I think my experience over the past decade has said that if you try to predict political processes over even over the course of a couple of months, but let alone over several decades, you're always going to be wrong. So what is likely by the end of the century is to such a high degree determined by what we will be doing today. And I mean, I even don't know what we will be doing tomorrow, but what I see is that climate change will be increasingly urgent. It is already urgent today. The call of civil society will be increasingly loud. And so I can only be hopeful that this will lead to effective action for the pledges to be actually implemented, and for these actions to even be strengthened. So I wouldn't put a number because it will always be wrong and it would only be misconceived. At the same time, the difference between 1.5 degrees and 3 degrees of warming is enormous. I mean, we don't have a lot of time on this, but already just the difference between 1.5 and 2 is basically means the end for several vulnerable ecosystems, including coral reefs, Arctic ecosystems, mountain ecosystems, and so on. And in some cases can result in a multi-century commitment to higher sea level rise. So the differences are really enormous.
And I would have a similar response as Yuri for a different reason. So to me, the question about what the temperature will be is similar to saying, what's the likelihood of me going running tomorrow before Thanksgiving dinner? And the point there is, it's up to us. It's just not exogenous. This is not something that's just going to happen because fossil fuel companies decide to comply or not. This is all of us using our talents and doing something and putting on political pressure to make happen. So I really don't want to think of this as something that's an object out there that happens to us. It's something that we can make a difference on.
Maybe do one more question. I know we're a little bit over time, but ran over a little bit with the initial remarks. So one question is, I guess, the role of development of fossil fuels in developing countries that traditionally haven't had much historical impact. How does that play into these pledges and ambitions? And the question that comes from one of the attendees: should, for example, huge oil discoveries in East Africa just be buried, or what's the role of that in this global climate target?
Well, I can start on that, and then I hope others will add to that. I mean, the fact of the matter is that it's not just climate alone that is driving the phase out of fossils. There are other environmental impacts that are associated with the use of fossil fuels. We know that coal causes local air pollution, health impacts, has implications for ecosystems and biodiversity. And so, as was mentioned already earlier in the presentations that were made, is I think Greg said it. It's basically we need to shift the whole focus from viewing these fossil fuels as an asset to actually a liability. And I mean, this is not going to happen overnight. And I think the phrasing in the text being phased down, not phase out, also acknowledges the fact that it's in some ways unfair to think of it happening overnight, but it does happen quite rapidly. So it's not like we can reach those goals without doing it.
I would just like to add as well that when we're talking about developing countries and they're using fossil fuels to develop, I think we also need to talk about the lack of financial help and support that Shonali mentioned too, talking about loss and damage. As much as we want developing countries to leapfrog and develop more sustainably, we do have to recognize the history of colonialism and power structures that are contributing to their use of fossil fuels for development. So as much as I'd love to see developing countries leapfrog, we also need to think about the financial support and contributions that haven't been there and are worsening this kind of divide between the global north and the global south.
All right. Maybe one final question about institutions. Glenn was asking, how critical is a healthy democracy to having institutions that can retain credibility and be in a position to act?
I mean, in the societies that we're living in, it's crucial. It's, how do you, especially going through a change, how do you reflect really heterogeneous preferences about what we want from our society, what we want from our energy system, how we want to deal with the climate, and over many years, and taking into account, people that are young and have different preferences from those that are maybe used to a fossil fuel infrastructure or invested in it. I mean, it's absolutely crucial. So that's, yeah, I think it's a good question in the Q&A. It's important and hard for the UN to do something about. That's domestic work.
Yeah, and I can maybe also add to this some experiences in Europe and in the UK with so-called citizen assemblies, which are not necessarily directly setting or defining policies, but are really informing parliament or governments about what a representative set of the population can come up with as a consensus agreement on what should be done about climate change. And I think these are really powerful fora because, for example, in the UK, where we have a committee on climate change, which is basically a government watchdog and a kind of advisor in an advisory role to the government, even they were surprised by the ambition of the suggestions that came out of this citizens' assembly in terms of behavioral change. These were suggestions that these analysts considered entirely outside of the realm of what society or what citizens would consider acceptable. But ultimately, this group of people, which included representatives of all walks of life and of all social settings, came up with a unanimous or consensus on very ambitious action and very ambitious measures. So I think that is also a way to really make sure that those voices are being heard and that everybody also understands what where this will be leading to. I think it is important to also ultimately understand that we are doing here is we're working towards a desirable future, not one where we have to cut out a lot of things and we will end up almost naked. No, it is one where we actually are working towards something that we positively desire.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much to all our panelists today for your insights and information to help us understand what happened at COP26, and then really thinking about what does it mean for ourselves in taking action. I think the big takeaway is really it's on us to hold our leaders to account, to make sure that those pledges lead to actual policies and actions, and keep the pressure on our leaders to lead us to a better future. So thank you all again for the presentations and the discussion. And thank you all, the attendees here, for the questions. And we appreciate your interest and involvement in this webinar. Hope those of us in the United States have a happy Thanksgiving and well wishes to everyone around the world. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.